I want to be very clear about one thing. I did not mean to save her life. I meant to save my own. The seal blew at 14:07, station time. I know the exact minute because I had just checked my watch, a habit my old supervisor called annoying and I called essential, and I was 3 meters into a restricted pressurization corridor on level 9 of Ethan Prime when the alarm started screaming. Not the polite chime the Valoon used for low-priority warnings. The real alarm, the one that meant something, was very wrong with the air staying inside the station instead of rushing out into open space. My name is Devon Carell. I am 31 years old. I am a structural engineer. I was stationed on Ethan Prime as a technical consultant for a Valoon atmospheric systems contractor called Varec Industrial, a job that paid well, required 14 months away from Earth, and was supposed to be boring. That last part was the selling point. I had specifically asked for boring. What I had not asked for was a catastrophic seal failure in Corridor 9 Delta during routine inspection, with no emergency team within 4 minutes of my position and a pressure differential that was already making my ears hurt. I moved before I thought about it. That is not bravery. That is what happens when your brain recognizes a solvable problem faster than your fear can catch up. The breach was at junction point 3, where 2 atmospheric feeds crossed over a structural support node, a design I had flagged in my inspection notes 2 weeks earlier as carrying more stress than the original spec intended. Nobody had fixed it. Varec Industrial had a policy of addressing inspection notes in order of priority, and apparently nobody had prioritized the one that said, "This will fail eventually." Well, eventually had arrived. I pulled the emergency kit from the wall panel, Valoon design, which meant everything was color-coded in a spectrum I could only partially see, and I used what I could identify by shape: a pressure clamp, a sealant pack, 2 structural rods that were not technically meant for what I was about to use them for, but would work, because the physics did not care about the manufacturer's intended application. That was when I noticed her. She was pressed against the far wall of the corridor junction, and she was not moving. She was not human. The Ethan looked something like a cross between a heron and a person, tall and pale-feathered, with large dark eyes, and they moved with a kind of slow grace that I had come to associate with confidence. This one was not moving with grace. She was frozen. The pressure differential had pinned her coat against the wall vent, and the vent was pulling, and if the seal went completely before I got the clamp in place, the vent would not stop at her coat. I did not know who she was. I genuinely could not tell one Ethan from another at that point. I had been on the station for 3 weeks and had not yet developed whatever visual calibration was needed. I saw a person who was going to be seriously hurt, and I saw a problem I could fix if I worked fast enough. I worked fast enough. The clamp went in at an angle the manufacturer had definitely not designed for. The sealant pack required me to use my left hand while my right hand held the structural rods in position, which is the kind of thing that sounds impossible until the alternative is watching someone get pulled into a vacuum vent. I held everything in place for 90 seconds. The alarm shifted pitch, from the real alarm to the lower, steadier tone that meant the crisis was contained, not resolved, but contained. My ears stopped hurting. The pressure differential dropped. The young woman's coat fell away from the vent. She stood very still for a moment, and then she looked at me with those large dark eyes, and she said something in Ethan that my translation module processed as, "You should not have been able to do that." I was sitting on the floor by then. My ribs hurt. I had torn the left knee of my work trousers on the floor panel. The hazmat suit I had been wearing over my clothes had a long crack in the shoulder seam from where I had braced against the wall, which meant it was no longer rated for anything and was going to cost me 2 weeks of per diem to replace. The clamp angle was unconventional, I said, but the load math worked out. She stared at me. I stared back. Down the corridor, I could hear the emergency response team finally arriving. 4 minutes and 20 seconds after the alarm, I noted, which was going to go in my report, and the sound of boots on the metal floor, and then the sound of those boots stopping very suddenly. One of the responders said something in Athon so fast my translation module skipped it entirely. Another one said, very clearly, in the universal trade language we all used for interspecies communication, "That is the princess." I looked at the young woman. She looked at me. I said, "I don't suppose there's a cash bonus for this." She did not answer, but something shifted in her expression, something that, if she had been human, I might have called the beginning of a reluctant smile. The next 4 minutes were chaos. The responders swarmed the corridor, running scans, checking the seal I had put in place, checking her, checking me, talking over each other in 2 languages simultaneously. Someone took a photograph of the clamp angle and then took 3 more photographs, like they could not believe what they were seeing. One of the responders asked me, in very careful trade language, where I had learned that technique. "Engineering school," I said. "Earth. We use a version of it for bridge supports." They did not seem to know what to do with that answer. I retrieved my inspection kit from where it had slid against the wall, checked that my datapad had survived intact. It had, barely, and waited for someone to tell me what happened next. The princess, whose name I still did not know, had been guided to the side of the corridor and was speaking quietly with 2 of the responders. Once, she glanced back at me. I gave her a small nod. She held my gaze for a moment, then looked away. A senior response officer, I could tell by the number of markings on his collar, which my briefing documents had explained, but which I could never quite remember the exact meaning of, came over and stood in front of me with an expression that I would later come to recognize as the Athon version of someone trying very hard to process unexpected information calmly. "You are the human technical consultant," he said, "Davin Coral." "Yes," I said. "You were in this corridor for what purpose?" "Routine inspection of the atmospheric feed junctions. I flagged junction 3 Delta 2 weeks ago. I was following up." He looked at the sealed junction. He looked at me. He looked at the sealed junction again. "You sealed it yourself." It seemed faster than waiting. He was quiet for a long moment. Behind him, I could see 2 more responders taking photographs of my work, and one of them appeared to be running calculations on a datapad, and the expression on that one's face suggested the calculations were not matching their expectations. "You will need to come with us," the officer said. "Am I in trouble?" He considered this with genuine seriousness, which I appreciated. "No," he said finally, "but there are people who will want to speak with you." I picked up my kit. I followed him down the corridor. As I passed the spot where she had been standing, I noticed the scorch mark on the wall where the vent had been pulling at her coat, and I noticed how close it was to the junction point, and I did the calculation in my head without meaning to. She had been 30 seconds away from a very bad outcome. I thought about that for a moment. Then I thought about my inspection report and the 2 weeks it had sat in Varek Industrial's queue without action. Then I thought about how I was going to phrase the follow-up report, because someone was going to have to explain why the junction had failed and why a human consultant had been the one to fix it. And I had learned long ago that the way you wrote a report mattered as much as what you put in it. I was still thinking about the report when they walked me into a room where 3 very senior Athon officials were waiting, and one of them was wearing the kind of formal collar arrangement that my briefing documents had specifically told me indicated imperial household staff, and I realized that the young woman I had just pulled away from a vacuum vent was probably not a junior technician. The official in the center looked at me. He looked at me the way people look at something that has appeared in a place where it absolutely should not be, and has somehow made itself necessary. "Davin Coral," he said, not a question. "Yes," I said. "You are aware of what you have done." I thought of the clamp, the rods, the 90 seconds with my hands braced against a wall while my ribs complained and the alarm screamed. "I sealed a junction that should have been fixed 2 weeks ago," I said. "I can walk you through the load math, if that would help." The official looked at the others in the room. Something passed between them that I could not read. "You saved the life of Princess Sivari vel Athon," he said, "eldest heir to the Athon Imperium." I sat with that information for a moment. "Oh," I said. Yes, he said. I thought of her expression when I had given her that small nod. The almost smile, the dark eyes that had held mine for just a moment before she looked away. Is there a cash bonus? I asked. It was a reflex. I regretted it immediately. The official did not answer, but across the room, through the half-open door where one of the responders was standing, I heard a sound that might have been someone laughing quietly, very quickly, before they stopped themselves. I filed it away. I had a feeling I was going to need all the information I could gather in the next few hours, because something in the way these officials were looking at me suggested that my life had just changed in a direction I had not planned for, and I had very specifically planned for boring. I had been on Aethon Prime for 23 days. I had flagged 11 structural concerns in my inspection reports. I had eaten the same 3 meals on rotation because the station's food options for humans were limited. I had called my mother twice, written 4 reports that nobody had acted on, and read 2 books. And now I was sitting in a room with Imperial household staff, having just accidentally saved the life of a princess, and the senior official in the center was looking at me like he was calculating something that I was not going to enjoy. I straightened my posture. I checked that my datapad was still recording. I waited. The door behind the officials opened. Princess Savari walked in. She was taller than I had realized in the corridor, and she moved with the grace I had not seen before, the slow, deliberate movement of someone who had been trained to enter rooms in a way that reminded everyone present of exactly who she was. She stopped when she saw me. I stood up, because it seemed like the right thing to do. We looked at each other for a moment across the quiet room. "You are the engineer," she said. "Yes," I said. "You fixed the junction?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, why? I thought about that. It was a fair question. There were easier things I could have done. I could have run. I could have sealed myself into the emergency alcove 20 meters back and waited for the response team. The physics would have been survivable from there. "It was the faster solution," I said, "and you were in the way of the slow one." Something moved through her expression. Not the almost smile this time. Something more complicated, something that looked like a person recalibrating. "The faster solution," she said, very quietly. "The load math worked out," I said. I checked. She looked at me for another long moment. Then she turned and said something to the officials in Rapid Aethon that my translation module caught the edge of, something about arrangements and formality, and something that might have been the word unusual. I sat back down. I noted that my ribs still hurt. I noted that the hazmat suit was definitely going to cost me 2 weeks of per diem. I noted that the princess had not answered my question about the cash bonus, which probably meant no. What I did not note, because I could not have known it yet, was that I had just become the most complicated political situation the Aethon Imperium had encountered in 60 years. That part, I found out later. That part changed everything. The summons came at dawn, Aethon Prime Time, which meant nothing to my human circadian rhythm, but meant a great deal to the 11 officials who filed into my guest quarters at 6 o'clock station time and stood in a very serious row while I finished my coffee. I had been given guest quarters the previous evening. Not my usual contractor bunk in the technical staff wing, actual guest quarters with a view of the gas giant outside and furniture that had been adjusted to human proportions by someone who had clearly consulted a diagram rather than ever met a human, because the chair was slightly too wide and the bed was slightly too short and the bathroom fixtures were all about 8 centimeters too high. I had slept badly and woken early and made coffee from the emergency pack I always kept in my kit, because I had learned in 14 months of alien assignment that the first thing you secured on any new posting was a reliable caffeine source. I offered the officials coffee. They declined. I drank mine. They waited. Their patience was impressive. I will give the Aethon that. They were extraordinarily patient, in the way of people who had been managing an empire for centuries and had learned that rushing things rarely improved outcomes. They stood in their row, and they waited while I finished my coffee and rinsed my cup and checked my datapad, and then turned around and said, "All right. What is this about?" The lead official, I had learned his name by then from the briefing documents, Counselor Varen, senior household administrator, 40 years in imperial service, folded his hands and said, "You are summoned to the court of Emperor Kelveth Vel Athan. You are requested to present yourself in formal dress at the 10th hour." I looked at him. "I am a structural engineer from Leeds," I said. "I do not own formal dress." Arrangements have been made. Of course they had. The formal dress turned out to be a human suit, a real one, apparently sourced overnight from somewhere, because it fit correctly and was made of decent cloth and had no visible signs of having been manufactured in 6 hours by someone working from a description. Someone on this station had access to a human tailor or a very good fabrication system, or both. I filed that away as interesting and put on the suit and let the household attendant, a young Athan woman who communicated entirely through hand signals and seemed deeply unbothered by the task of dressing a human, straighten the collar and then stand back and study me with the expression of an artist examining a finished work. She gave a small nod. I took this as approval. The imperial court of Athan Prime was built to impress, and it succeeded. I had read descriptions of it in my orientation documents, the great crystalline walls that captured and refracted the light of the gas giant outside, the floor of polished black stone that reflected everything above it like still water, the tiered galleries where hundreds of courtiers could stand and observe the proceedings below. The documents had said impressive and historically significant, and one of the architectural achievements of the Veluun Confederation. What the documents had not said was that it was also genuinely cold, acoustically bizarre. Every footstep echoed in a way that made it sound like there were 3 of you, and designed on a scale that made a human feel approximately the size of a house cat. I walked across the floor. My footsteps echoed 6 times each. 2,000 courtiers watched from the galleries. I kept my eyes forward and my breathing steady and thought about load math, because load math was calming. Emperor Kelveth Vel Athan was old. That was the first thing I noticed, not because Athan showed age the way humans did, but because there was a quality to him that I could only call weight. He sat on the imperial seat at the far end of the hall, and he sat in it the way a mountain sits on the earth, as though removal were not a concept that applied to him. He had ruled for 240 years, the document said. He looked like someone who had fully accepted that fact. Princess Savari was standing to his right. She was dressed formally now, which meant more layers than I had seen in the corridor, and the formal bearing she had shown in my guest quarters was even more apparent here. She looked at me as I approached. I looked at her. Her expression gave me nothing. I stopped at the indicated distance. There was a pattern in the floor, I had been told, that marked the correct spot for an audience, and I had memorized it from a diagram, and I inclined my head in the formal greeting gesture I had practiced twice in the lift on the way down here. The Emperor studied me for a long moment. "Davan Korel," he said. His voice was low and carried perfectly in the strange acoustics. "Human, engineer." "Yes," I said. "You preserved the life of my daughter." "I sealed a junction," I said. "She happened to be near it." Something moved through the court at that. A ripple of reaction I could not fully interpret. The Emperor's expression did not change. "The specifics are noted," he said. "The outcome is what the law addresses." I had a sudden, specific feeling in my chest, the kind of feeling that arrives when you are looking at a structural diagram and you notice a load-bearing element that should not be where it is, the feeling that something is about to go in an unexpected direction. "The law," I said. "The Vethkar," the Emperor said. "The Compact of Preservation, ancient law, older than the Confederation itself. One who preserves the royal bloodline at personal cost is bound to that bloodline in obligation." I waited. I had learned, in 14 months of working with alien governments, that the worst thing you could do when someone was explaining something important was to interrupt before they reached the end. In the context of the air, the emperor continued. The binding takes a specific form. He told me what the form was. He told me very clearly, with great ceremony, in front of 2,000 witnesses. I stood there and listened to the emperor of the Aethon Imperium explain, in complete detail, that I was to be formally joined to his daughter in the closest equivalent to marriage that their law contained. When he finished, the court was very quiet. I said, "I'm sorry. Could someone explain what's happening? I don't think my translation module is working correctly." It was working correctly. I understood every word. But I needed 30 seconds to think, and saying, "Please wait while I process this," seemed inadvisable, and so I used the one tool available. I pretended confusion. Princess Savari, from her position to her father's right, looked at me, and for just a moment, I saw it, the thing she did not want the court to see. Anger, not at me, at the old man on the imperial seat, quick and clean and then gone, tucked back behind the formal bearing. She had not known, or she had known and not known this was coming today. Either way, she was not pleased. I filed that away too. A court official stepped forward and repeated the emperor's words in slower, clearer trade language, as though I were a child who had not understood. I listened with an expression of careful attention and thought about what I was going to do next. What I was not going to do was agree. Not here, not now, not in front of 2,000 witnesses without reading whatever legal document underpinned this first. I had a rule about agreeing to things I had not read, and I had never once broken it, and I was not going to start in the imperial court of Aethon Prime. "I appreciate the honor," I said, when the official finished. "I would like to review the relevant legal text before responding formally. This is a significant commitment, and I want to give it the consideration it deserves." The official looked at me. He looked at the emperor. The emperor looked at me with an expression that I recognized from difficult clients, the expression of a person who had not expected resistance and was recalculating. "The Vethkar does not require agreement," Councillor Varen said, from the side. "It is a binding of obligation." "I'm afraid," I said politely, "that I didn't sign it." "And in human law, a contract you didn't sign isn't a contract. I'd like to discuss the overlap." The court made that ripple sound again, louder this time. The emperor was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You will have 30 days to consider your honor in this matter." It was not quite a capitulation, and it was not quite a concession, and it was phrased in a way that gave him every option available going forward. He was good at this. 240 years of practice will do that for you. "Thank you," I said. I inclined my head again in the formal gesture. I turned and walked back across the floor, and my footsteps echoed 6 times each, and 2,000 courtiers watched me go, and I kept my breathing steady and my face neutral, and thought about nothing except where the nearest private room was where I could sit down and write a very careful message to Earth's diplomatic office. I found it 20 minutes later, a small records room off the corridor behind the court, empty, with a locking door and a window that looked out on the gas giant. I sat down. I opened my datapad. I wrote the subject line first, because the subject line was the most important part. Need advice. Nothing on fire yet. Then I started writing, and I told them everything, and I chose every word with great care, because whatever happened next was going to depend very much on what I said in the next few hours. Above me, through the window, the gas giant turned slowly in the dark. Enormous and indifferent and beautiful. I had been on Aethon Prime for 24 days. I had a feeling the next 26 were going to be considerably more complicated. I had expected many things from Princess Savari after the court session. Silence, distance, a formal note delivered through an intermediary. What I had not expected was for her to knock on the door of my guest quarters at 2200 hours, alone, without announcement, and stand in the doorway with the formal bearing gone and something much more direct in its place. I had been reading the Vethkar, or trying to. The original text was in Old Aethon, and my translation module handled it with the confidence of someone guessing at a foreign language while pretending they were fluent, technically coherent, probably wrong in ways that mattered. I had 6 translation attempts open on my datapad, all of them slightly different from each other, and I was cross-referencing them against my legal notes and not making nearly enough progress. She looked at the datapad. She looked at me. "You are reading the compact," she said. "Trying to," I said. "The translation is inconsistent. The third clause in Section 2 reads differently in 4 of the 6 versions I have, and the difference matters legally." She was quiet for a moment. Then she stepped inside without asking if she could, and she sat down in the too-wide chair, and she crossed her hands in her lap, and she said, "I will tell you what the third clause means. In exchange, you will listen to what I need to say." I put down the datapad. "All right," I said. What followed was the most unusual 2 hours I have ever spent in any room, on any planet or station, in human or alien space. She told me about the Kelvorath. She told me in clear, direct language, without diplomatic softening, the way someone talks when they have decided that the situation is too serious for anything except the truth. The Kelvorath were a separatist faction, not new, not fringe, but old and well-organized and growing. They believed the Aethan Imperium was an obstacle to what the Veluun Confederation could become, and they had spent the last 3 years demonstrating their commitment to that belief by eliminating the people who stood in their way. 3 members of the imperial family in 4 years, 1 senior military commander, 2 government officials whose positions had been critical to the political stability of the outer territories. All of them gone, none of the cases solved. "We know who they are," Savari said. "We do not have legal grounds to move against them. They are careful." "And the compact," I said. "Your father." She was quiet for a moment. In the quiet, I could hear the station's environmental systems running, the soft, constant sound of air being moved and filtered, the sound I had stopped hearing consciously weeks ago and now noticed again because everything else was very still. "My father has been afraid for a long time," she said. "Fear makes people act in ways they would not otherwise choose." "He arranged it," I said. "Not a question." I had been thinking about it since the court session, the junction I had flagged 2 weeks ago. The inspection visit, the specific corridor, the specific time, the specific failure, the seal. It was not an accident. She did not answer immediately. She looked out the window at the gas giant, and I watched her profile, and I waited. "I do not know," she said finally. "I have asked myself that question since yesterday. I do not know if he arranged it or if he simply used it when it happened. I am not certain which answer I prefer. Because one of them means he put you at risk deliberately." "Yes," she said. "That one." I sat with that for a moment. It was a heavy thing to sit with. "The compact binds me to the Imperium," I said. "Which means any move against you becomes a move against a human citizen. Which means Earth is watching. Which means the Kelvorath have to calculate a variable they have never had to calculate before," she said. "Yes." "That is the logic," I said. "That is why he did it." "That is the logic," she agreed. "Whether or not he arranged the junction." I looked at my datapad. The 6 translation versions of the Vethkar sat open on the screen, all slightly different, all agreed on the basic structure: obligation, binding, protection, reciprocity, 600 years old and written for a world that had not known humans existed. "I am not going to agree to a marriage," I said. "To be clear, I am not saying that as a position to negotiate from. It is a genuine limit." "I am not asking you to," she said. "I am asking you to understand the situation fully before you decline everything." I looked at her. She looked back at me with the dark eyes that were, I was beginning to understand, considerably sharper than the formal bearing made them appear. "What are you asking me to do?" I said. "Stay," she said, "voluntarily. Not because the compact forces you, because you have looked at the situation and decided it is worth your time." "Why would I decide that?" "Because you read 6 versions of an ancient legal text on your first night in guest quarters," she said. "Because you flagged 11 structural concerns in 3 weeks, when the previous consultant flagged 2 in 6 months. because when an alarm sounded in a corridor, you ran toward it. I was quiet. You are not a person who leaves problems unresolved, she said. And this is a very large problem. I thought about that for a while. Outside, the gas giant turned. The environmental systems moved the air quietly around us. The third clause, I said. Section 2. What does it mean? The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The same thing I had seen in the corridor, briefly, before it was gone. It means the obligation runs both ways, she said. Preservation is a reciprocal act. Whatever is owed to you is owed equally in return. I looked at the datapad. The third clause, in 4 of the 6 translation versions, had read as one directional. In 2 of them, it had read as something else. The 2 were correct. All right, I said. She waited. I am not agreeing to the compact, I said. I want that on the record, but I am not leaving tomorrow. I am going to stay for the 30 days, and I am going to read everything I can find, and I am going to think about this the way I think about structural problems, which means I am going to look at every load-bearing element before I decide anything. That is all I am asking, she said. She stood. She moved to the door. She paused. The junction, she said. Your fix. The response team said it should not have held. It held, I said. Yes, she said. It did. She left. I sat in the too-wide chair for a long time after. Then I picked up my datapad and opened a new document and started writing a different kind of notes. Not inspection notes. Not a report for Varec Industrial. Notes on people, on political structures, on the load-bearing elements of an empire that was trying not to fall. I had been on Aethon Prime for 25 days. I had told myself I came here for boring. I was beginning to suspect that boring was not an option anymore, and that some part of me, the part that ran toward alarms instead of away from them, was not entirely upset about that. 3 nights later, they tried to kill her in the palace. I had been in the records archive on level 6, which was 2 floors below the Imperial residential wing and about 40 meters from where it happened. I know because I heard the alarm, the real one, the serious one, and I had already pulled up the station schematics on my datapad before I had consciously decided to move. There were 2 ways to get from level 6 to the residential wing quickly. The official route, which was a main corridor that would take 4 minutes and would be clogged with security personnel responding to the same alarm. And the maintenance route, service passages that ran behind the walls of the residential wing, used by the station's environmental technicians, not mapped in the security system's tactical display because they were not considered a threat vector. I took the maintenance route. I know every service passage within 4 floors of wherever I am working. It is a habit. My old supervisor would have called it excessive. I call it useful. The passage behind Corridor 7 on the residential level was narrow and warm, and smelled like recycled air. I moved through it fast, using my datapad schematic display as a guide, and I came out through a service panel into Corridor 7 at the same moment that 3 Kelvorath operatives were moving toward the room at the far end where Savari's quarters were located. I did not have a weapon. I want to be clear about that. What I had was a datapad with access to the station's environmental control system, 3 minutes of thinking time on the way through the passage, and a thorough understanding of what happens to structural integrity when you redirect pressurized atmosphere through a corridor that is not rated for that volume of flow. I rerouted the flow. The corridor did not collapse. I want to be clear about that too. I was careful. I redirected pressure from 2 adjacent feeds into the tertiary vent system above Corridor 7, and the resulting pressure differential was enough to make the floor buckle in 2 specific spots that I had identified on the schematic as points of existing weakness. Not catastrophically, just enough, just exactly enough. The 3 operatives were moving fast, and they were not watching the floor, and when it buckled under them at 2 specific points, they went down hard, and the security team that came through the main corridor 30 seconds later found them in a state that made restraint considerably easier. I was standing against the wall with my datapad in my hands when the security team arrived. Their commander looked at me. He looked at the operatives on the floor. He looked at the 2 buckled spots in the corridor floor. He looked at me again. I redirected some pressure, I said. The floor will need a support brace at points 3 and 7. I can write up the repair spec. He stared at me for a long moment. The door at the end of the corridor opened. Savari stepped out. She was holding a short blade in her right hand. She had been ready, I noted, which meant she had heard them coming and had not simply waited, and she looked at the corridor and the operatives and me. "You saved me again," she said. Her voice was even. Her hand was steady on the blade. "I redirected pressure," I said. "You were adjacent to the problem." She looked at me for a long moment. Something in her expression that I was beginning to be able to read. Not perfectly, not yet, but beginning. Something that was not quite the almost smile, and not quite the controlled anger, and not quite relief. Something in between all three. "You are going to keep doing this," she said. "I am going to keep fixing structural problems," I said. "If you are consistently near structural problems, that is going to continue to overlap." The security commander was writing something in a report. He had the expression of a person whose job had just become significantly more complicated. "Please tell your father," I said to Saivari, "that I would like to start the compact renegotiation discussions tomorrow. At a reasonable hour, I have some proposed language changes." She looked at me, she looked at the operatives, she looked at her blade, she put the blade away. "I will tell him," she said. "Thank you," I said. I put my datapad back in my kit. My hands were shaking slightly. They had been the whole time, and I had not let it show, and now that the problem was resolved, the shaking was working its way out. This was normal. The fear always came after, not during. During, the math kept me busy. I went back to my quarters, and I sat down, and I wrote the proposed language changes for the compact renegotiation, and I did not think about how close the corridor at the residential wing had been to a very different outcome. I thought about load-bearing elements instead. I thought about what it meant that she had been holding a blade and had been ready. I thought about the fact that I had told her I was staying for 30 days to think, and that I was now on day 28, and that I had not once seriously considered leaving. That was, I thought, probably information. I filed it carefully. I went back to writing. Outside the window, the gas giant turned, slow and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the political complications of the beings orbiting it. I had been on Athen Prime for 28 days. I had stopped counting the days as a measure of when I might leave. That, too, was probably information. The Kel Vorath came in force on the 31st day. I know the exact time because my watch said 03:47 when the alarm woke me, the real alarm, the station-wide one, the kind that hits every speaker simultaneously and leaves no ambiguity about severity. I was dressed and reading the station schematics on my datapad before I was fully awake. That is what happens when you have heard that alarm twice in 30 days. Your body stops waiting for your brain to catch up. I had been given a security clearance 4 days earlier. Not a military clearance, an engineering clearance, which theoretically meant access to maintenance systems and structural data. In practice, it meant access to almost everything because the Athon had designed their station's infrastructure on an integrated model where the environmental systems, the structural systems, and the security systems shared a backbone. It was efficient. It was also the kind of design decision that looks excellent until someone who understands all three systems simultaneously is motivated to use them against you. I was not going to use them against the Athon. I want to be clear about that. I was going to use them against the people who had just breached the outer ring of Athon Prime with 9 assault craft and a tactical plan that was sophisticated, well prepared, and had one critical weakness. It had been designed against the station's official defense grid, which the Kel Vorath had spent 2 years mapping. They had not mapped the maintenance routes. I put on my jacket, I took my datapad, I went to work. The station's defense grid went partially offline at 03:52. The Kel Vorath had assets inside, and those assets had done their job. Lights went to emergency level. Communication on the primary channels dropped to fragments. I could hear, distantly, the sound of the Imperial Guard moving through the corridors, and over my earpiece, I had requisitioned one 3 days ago on the theory that it might become relevant. I could hear Commander Oren coordinating the defense response in the clipped, efficient language of someone who had trained for exactly this and was now discovering that the training had not covered everything. I opened a channel to Oren. I said, "This is Corel, engineering clearance. I have the full schematic on my datapad and I can see where they are. Can you hear me?" A pause. Then, "Corel, human engineer. Yes." "Why are you awake?" "The alarm woke me," I said, "and I read schematics before bed. Commander, I can see 3 Kel-Vorath strike teams using corridors your security display is not showing you, because those corridors are not in the tactical system. I can seal them, redirect them, or slow them down. What do you need?" Another pause. Shorter this time. Commander Oren was, I had learned, a person who made decisions fast when the situation required it. "Tell me where they are," she said. I told her. I told her where all 3 teams were, and where they were going, and what the fastest route to intercept each one was, and which routes to intercept them did not exist in the Kel-Vorath's tactical maps, and therefore would not be covered by their own counter-interception planning. She started moving units. I started working on the other part. The station had 47 atmospheric pressure nodes that could be individually controlled through the engineering maintenance system. Under normal operation, they ran on automatic balance. Under manual control, they could be redirected. The Kel-Vorath's assault plan relied on clear movement through 3 specific corridor networks. I could see this from the pattern of where their teams were going and where they were not. Those 3 corridor networks shared one thing. They all ran through zones served by nodes 12, 19, and 34. I sealed node 12 first. The effect was subtle. A slight pressure increase in the targeted corridors that would feel like nothing to the operatives moving through them and would register as minor on any environmental scan. What it would do over the next 4 minutes was make the floor panels in those corridors expand fractionally, 4 millimeters. Enough to create irregular footing for someone moving fast in tactical equipment who had not been briefed to watch for it. Node 19 gave me sensor noise. I redirected a portion of the thermal output from the station's heating system into the corridors above level 4, and the resulting heat differential would read on the Kel-Vorath's thermal imaging as dozens of warm signatures, ghost readings that their scanners would try to resolve and fail because they were not life signs, just heat. It would not fool them for long. It did not need to. It needed to buy Commander Oren's teams 30 seconds of confusion in the enemy's tactical display. Node 34 was the one I was careful with. Very careful. The corridor network it served included 3 civilian staff quarters, unlikely to be occupied at 04 o'clock, but not impossible, and I ran the pressure calculations 4 times before I acted. When I was certain, I used it to seal off the Kel-Vorath's primary retreat corridor, not dangerously, just enough atmospheric resistance to turn a fast exit into a slow one, which was the difference between a clean extraction and an interception. On the earpiece, Oren's voice. "They are slowing in Section 7. How did you do that?" "Pressure differential," I said. "The floor panels. 4 millimeters of expansion is enough if they are moving fast." A pause. "You are watching our tactical display?" "I am watching the maintenance display," I said. "It has more detail. Corel, the Emperor is in the residential wing. Strike team in Section 9 is heading directly—" "I see them," I said. "Rerouting now." Section 9 had a service access point at Junction 4 that connected to a parallel passage running behind the residential wing. It was used by the station's environmental technicians and did not appear on any map that the Kel-Vorath would have had access to, because it had been reclassified as a decommissioned route 18 months ago and removed from the public schematics. It was not decommissioned. It was just relabeled. I guided 2 of Oren's units through it. They came out behind the strike team. The engagement was over in 40 seconds. The Emperor was unhurt. A secondary team reached his position before the Kel Vorath's redirected strike team could regroup, and the combination of Oren's units and the pressure-sealed retreat corridor meant that regrouping took significantly longer than the Kel Vorath had planned for. At 05:23, the Kel Vorath transmitted a retreat order to their forces inside the station. By 05:31, the last of them had been restrained or had retreated to the breach point, where the outer ring security had reasserted control. I was sitting against the wall of Corridor 11, Section 3, at 05:34 when Commander Oren came to find me. I had been shot at from 3 directions, at approximately 04:58, by a Kel Vorath operative who had identified the source of the pressure redirection and reasonably concluded that removing that source was tactically sound. The shots had not connected. I had been moving, and I had also immediately sealed the corridor section behind me, which had required the operative to take a longer route that gave me time to get clear. I was not calm about this. I want to be honest, I was furious. Not frightened, furious. There is something about being shot at that strikes me as deeply unreasonable, and my reaction to it was less fear and more the specific anger of someone who has been interrupted in the middle of important work by something completely avoidable. I had said the word rude aloud, twice. There had been no one to hear me, which was fortunate. Oren found me sitting against the wall with my datapad open, writing up the repair spec for the pressure nodes I had modified, because they were going to need recalibration after the manual override, and I wanted the maintenance team to have accurate numbers. She looked at me for a long moment. "You coordinated that," she said. "I redirected pressure and gave you position data," I said. "Your teams did the rest." "From a maintenance display." "It has more detail than the tactical system," I said. "Someone should integrate them. I can write a proposal." She sat down against the wall opposite me. She was quiet for a moment. Around us, the station was moving back toward normal, the emergency lighting cycling down, the communication channels coming back online, the sound of security teams moving through the corridors in the methodical pattern of people securing a space rather than fighting through one. 47 lives, she said. What? The units I had in sections 4 through 9. If the Kel Vorath had moved through those corridors uncontested, she stopped. 47 people. I sat with that for a moment. I had not calculated it that way. I had been working the problem section by section, node by node, one redirect at a time. The aggregate had not been the number I was tracking. The math worked out, I said, quietly. Yes, she said. It did. She stood. She held out her hand, the Aethon formal offer of acknowledgement, which I had read about in the briefing documents and never seen offered to a human before. I took it. Her grip was firm and brief. "The Kel Vorath transmission after the retreat," she said. "They listed you by name." "I heard," I said. "They called you a military aggressor." "I find that baffling," I said. "I was doing maintenance." She looked at me for a long moment. And then Commander Oren of the Imperial Guard laughed, a short, real laugh without ceremony, and walked back down the corridor. I went back to writing the repair spec. At 07 o'clock, Counselor Varen came to find me with a message that the Emperor requested my presence at my earliest convenience. The message was formal and correct, and used all the appropriate honorifics. It was also, I noted, the first time I had been requested rather than summoned. I saved the repair spec. I closed my datapad. I stood up and straightened my jacket. My earliest convenience was, I decided, now. I followed Varen through the damaged corridors of the station, past the scorch marks and the sealed sections and the security teams still moving in their methodical patterns, and I thought about what the Emperor wanted to say to me. I had been on Aethon Prime for 31 days. I had a feeling the next conversation was going to matter more than all the previous ones combined. I was right. The Emperor looked older. I do not mean that as a figure of speech. I mean that in the 24 hours since the assault, something had shifted in him, some quality of the weight I had noticed the first time I saw him, but altered now, heavier in some ways, lighter in others. He was sitting in a smaller room than the court, a private meeting room with low lighting and furniture that had been designed for comfort rather than impression, and there were only 3 people with him: Counselor Varen, Commander Oren, and Savari. I sat down when invited. This was also new. I had not been invited to sit in his presence before. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "I owe you an honesty I did not offer before." I said nothing. I waited. He told me everything. He did it without apology, in the direct way of someone who had decided that the situation was past the point where careful political language was useful. He told me about the junction, that he had known it was failing, that he had known my inspection schedule, that he had not arranged the failure exactly, but had arranged the conditions that made it likely, and that when it happened, he had moved faster than he had planned because the moment was there and might not come again. He told me about the Vethkar, that he had chosen it deliberately, that he had been prepared to invoke it for months if the right moment came, that he had spent considerable effort constructing a situation where invoking it against a human would have legal defensibility. He told me about the Kel Vorath, more than Saivari had told me, the intelligence his government actually held, the scope of what they were willing to do, and how close they had already come. When he finished, the room was quiet. I looked at him. I looked at Saivari. She was watching me with the controlled expression that I now knew well enough to read underneath, waiting to see what I did. Oren was watching the table. Varen was watching the Emperor. "I appreciate the honesty," I said. "I did not offer it for your appreciation," he said. "I offered it because you have earned it, and because what I need now requires you to understand the full situation." "What do you need?" I said. "The Kel Vorath will not stop," he said. "They failed here. They will recalculate and try again. The Vethkar alone is not enough. It was a political maneuver, and they are past politics now. What I need is something they cannot calculate around." I looked at him. "Me," I said. "A human presence," he said. "Not symbolic, real, not a binding that can be challenged legally, but an actual arrangement between your government and mine that makes any move against the Imperium a move against human interests." "That is not mine to give," I said. "I am an engineer. I do not speak for Earth." "You speak to Earth," he said, "and Earth, from what I understand, has been reading your messages very carefully for the past 30 days. I thought of my first message, the subject line, "Nothing on fire yet," the 40 pages of carefully chosen detail I had sent since then. The response I had received 4 days ago that was 12 pages long, signed by 3 different diplomatic offices, and which I had read 4 times. "What are you proposing?" I said. He told me. It was not the Vethkar. He had moved past the Vethkar. What he was proposing was a formal accord, a documented agreement between the Aethon Imperium and Earth, structured around mutual interests, co-signed by both governments, which would mean that any aggressive action against the Imperium would require the Kel Vorath to calculate the human response as a real variable. It was, I thought, almost exactly what I had sketched out in my own notes 3 nights ago. Almost. The version I had sketched was somewhat different in structure, in a way that I thought mattered. "It needs to be written differently," I said. He looked at me. "Explain." "Your version places the obligation primarily on Earth," I said, "as a protection guarantee. That is not something Earth will sign. We have a policy against unilateral defense commitments to non-allied governments that we have not formally assessed. But a mutual interest framework, written as a trade and cooperation agreement with security provisions as a secondary element, can be signed under existing Earth diplomatic authority, and it accomplishes the same thing." The room was very quiet. "You have been thinking about this," the Emperor said. "I have been thinking about the load-bearing elements," I said. "This is a structural problem. The Kel Vorath are a stress that the current framework cannot support. The solution is not to resist the stress differently. The solution is to change the structure so the stress no longer has a point to attack." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at Saivari. She was watching me, and she was not hiding the thing in her expression now. She was letting it show, the not quite smile, and something else underneath it that was more complicated and more honest. "The compact," the Emperor said. "The Vethkar. You will not accept it as written." "No," I said, "but I will write a new one. In plain language, with clauses I can explain to anyone who asks, and provisions that run both directions. If you will let me write it, and if Saivari will review every line, and if we both agree on what it says before it is signed." The Emperor looked at his daughter. She looked at me. The almost smile settled into something that had stopped being almost. "I will review every line," she said. "Then we have a starting point," I said. I opened my datapad. I opened a new document. The Emperor watched me. Counselor Varen watched me. Commander Oren, who had not spoken once in the entire meeting, watched me. "You are going to write it now," the Emperor said, "somewhere between a question and a statement." "The structural problems never wait," I said, "and I work better when I start immediately." He was quiet for a moment, and then the Emperor of the Aethon Imperium, who had ruled for 240 years and had maneuvered me across 30 of them, said something I had not heard him say to anyone. "Very well," he said. "What do you need?" "Strong coffee," I said, "human version, if possible, and a legal dictionary in Old Aethon, and," I looked at Saivari, "someone who can tell me when my phrasing is wrong." "I can do that," she said. She pulled a chair next to mine. She sat down. She looked at the blank document on my datapad, and I looked at it, and then we both looked at each other for a moment with the shared expression of two people who have understood something. I started writing. The first clause was simple. The obligation runs both ways. I had learned that from the Vethkar. Preservation is a reciprocal act. Saivari read it. She nodded. The second clause took longer. We argued about it for 20 minutes, quietly, with the precise focus of people who knew that the wording was going to matter in ways neither of them could fully predict. The Emperor sat across the table and watched us argue and said nothing, and had the expression, I thought, of someone who had expected to be managing this situation and was instead watching it manage itself. By the end of the second hour, we had 7 clauses. Saivari had added 2 of her own. I had rewritten 3 of mine after she pointed out structural weaknesses in the reasoning. The Emperor's legal scholars, summoned reluctantly at hour 3, were horrified by the plain language and the lack of traditional formal structure, and the fact that 2 of the clauses contained explicit exit conditions, which ancient Aethon compacts never did. The Emperor approved it anyway. "It says what it means," he said to the scholars. "Every clause, nothing hidden, nothing that requires interpretation." He looked at me. "This is unusual for a legal document." "I find it helps with the load-bearing parts," I said. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said something that I filed away carefully, because it was the kind of thing you do not hear often. "I was wrong to manipulate you. I was not wrong about what needed doing, but I was wrong about how I did it. I want that acknowledged between us." I looked at him. He was looking back at me with the directness of someone who had decided that honesty was the only remaining useful tool. "Acknowledged," I said. He nodded once, and that was that. I sent the draft accord to Earth's diplomatic office that evening with a cover note that was 4 pages long, the shortest I had managed in 31 days. The subject line read, "Proposal attached. I think this works. Tell me what I got wrong." Their response came back in 6 hours. It was 2 pages long and listed 3 suggested edits and approved everything else. We signed the accord on the 34th day. The ceremony was smaller than the court session had been, no 2,000 witnesses, no crystalline hall, a meeting room, 5 signatures, 2 species. 1 document written in plain language that said exactly what it meant. The Kel Vorath's tactical response to the accord, according to the intelligence assessment Commander Oren shared with me 3 days later, was 48 hours of internal debate, followed by a significant reduction in operational planning. They had been ready for a political maneuver. They had not been ready for a human who had memorized their station's schematics, redirected their retreat, and then sat down and rewritten a 600-year-old legal compact in plain language before breakfast. The uncertainty was, as I had predicted, the deterrent. I called my mother on the 36th day. She asked how the assignment was going. I said it had been interesting. She asked if I was eating enough. I said the food options for humans were still limited, but I had found a supplier for reasonable coffee. She said that was good. She asked if I had made any friends. I thought about that for a moment. Possibly two, I said. I am still working out the definition. She said that sounded like me. She said to take care of myself. I said I would. On the 38th day, I submitted a formal repair specification for every structural concern I had flagged in my 38 days on Athen Prime, all 16 of them now, with detailed load calculations and proposed fixed timelines. Varec Industrial received it, and for the first time, responded within the same day. On the 40th day, Savari came to my quarters again, not at 2200 hours. In the afternoon, without ceremony, and she sat in the too-wide chair, and I made coffee, and we talked for 3 hours about nothing related to politics or compacts or Kel-Vorath or structural engineering. We talked about the gas giant visible through the window and what the Athon called it and what it looked like from the surface of the moons. We talked about Earth and whether she would ever visit and what she would think of Leeds in February, which I described accurately and without flattery. She said February sounded unpleasant. I said it was, and that I missed it sometimes. She looked at me with the expression I had been learning to read for 40 days, and she said, "You are not planning to leave." It was not a question. There are 9 more structural concerns on levels 12 through 14, I said, and the maintenance route integration proposal, and I told Oren I would consult on the security system redesign. Those things will eventually be finished, she said. Yes, I said, probably. She looked out at the gas giant. I looked at my coffee. The accord includes a provision, she said, for ongoing human technical presence on Athen Prime, for consultation. I wrote that clause, I said. I know, she said. We sat with that for a moment. The obligation runs both ways, I said. Yes, she said. That is what it says. I sent my final summary report to Earth's diplomatic office on the 42nd day. 43 pages. Everything. The junction, the court, the Vethkar, the assault, the accord, the structural repairs. All of it, in plain language, with load calculations where relevant. The subject line read, "Situation resolved. Did get the trade rights. Did not get married." Long story. The response came back in 4 hours. It was 3 lines long. Excellent work. Trade rights noted. Please continue your assignment for the foreseeable future. We have questions about the structural maintenance integration proposal. Call when convenient. I put down the data pad. I looked out the window at the gas giant, enormous and slow and patient, turning in the dark the way it had been turning since long before anyone in this station had existed. I thought about what Savari had said, not planning to leave. I thought about the load-bearing elements of the situation, an empire that was less likely to fall than it had been 42 days ago, a compact written in plain language that said exactly what it meant, a Kel-Vorath faction calculating variables they did not know how to resolve, and a princess who sat in my too-wide chair and told me the truth in plain language because she had decided I was worth telling. I thought about what my mother had asked, whether I had made any friends. I had told her possibly 2. I was working out the definition. In the official Athen Imperial Record, maintained by the Imperial Archivists, the events of those 42 days were eventually catalogued under a category that had been created specifically for the occasion, because no existing category covered what had happened. The category was noted in the record as meaning, approximately, outcomes produced by the inexplicable persistence of humans. Savari found it in the archive 3 months later and showed it to me. She did not seem to find it unusual. I found it funny, which is a human thing. I told her so. She looked at me for a moment with the expression I had been reading for months by then, fully readable now, no longer only approximate, and she said, "Yes, it is." I had been on Aethon Prime for a long time by then. Long enough that I had stopped thinking about it as being away, long enough that the gas giant through my window was a familiar sight, and the sound of the environmental systems was background noise again, and the maintenance routes were as familiar as the hallways of any building I had ever lived in. I fixed a breach. I stayed because the math was interesting. I rewrote a 600-year-old law because it had a logical error in it, and I cannot leave logical errors alone. It is a character flaw. My mother always said so. And in the middle of all that, I made 2 friends. The definition had resolved itself gradually, without announcement, the way structural problems sometimes reach equilibrium, not because you finished working on them, but because the load had finally found somewhere stable to rest. The galaxy, it turns out, is mostly the same as anywhere else, full of people who are afraid and determined and doing the best they can with what they have. I find that comforting. I think that is a human thing.